The excavations of Eilat Mazar, who describe the finds as the palace of King David, first and foremost, we need to say that this is a highly important excavation. And secondly, we need to say that it was carried out in a good method, in a good technique. It's an important excavation and a reliable excavation with many difficulties. It is on the slope of the city of David, erosion and so on. This is an area which had been excavated before. I mean, most of the area had been almost completely excavated to bedrock in the 1920s. And in fact, Eilat uncovers mainly debris which had been put back by the excavators of the 1920s. So there are many objective difficulties facing her in the excavation. I'm an archaeologist. So for me, I can rank context, okay, from let's say 0 to 10. 0, dubious context. 10, best context in archaeology. Archaeology is all about context. Because context, decides everything. Dating, stratigraphy, the whole thing rests on the context. So we are sitting here near, pottery from Megiddo. So I come from Megiddo. If I take a destruction layer at Megiddo of a certain stratum around the beginning of the 10th century, with 2 meters of debris of collapse, with everything resting on the floors, representing the moment of destruction. In the moment of destruction, everything collapsed and everything is there. This is a context which I would describe as close to 10. There's no 10 because always you have a possibility that, came there a mouse and took, one sherd and moved it to another point, or took a small olive pit that we are going to date radiocarbon-wise and, move it from one stratum to another. So let's give it 10 minus. When I look at the excavations of the city of David there, the palace of King David, I would give it somewhere between 0 and 1 compared to the 10 minus, because there is nothing safe there. Not because Eilat Mazar is not a good excavator. She is a good excavator. Because of the objective difficulties there. Of erosion, of excavations in the past, of bits and pieces of everything, of later activities. You know that, for instance, in that area of the city of David, there are, and there were also in the first excavation, finds from the Second Temple period almost all the way down to bedrock. So this is a very complicated context. And this is the reason why we have to be extremely careful when we come to date the buildings, and even more so when we try to reconstruct history according to these finds. To make a long story short, I think that there are different periods represented in the walls that were unearthed by Eilat Mazar in that part of the city of David. Some of them may date to the late Iron 2A, which means the 9th century BC, and some of them possibly even later. And in any event, also because of radiocarbon dating and so on, and because the bits and pieces that you find there do not connect, there is no connection between a small vessel here and a wall there is no floor. It's all highly problematic, and again, not because of the excavation, because of the nature of the site, okay? So in a situation like this, I don't think that we can speak about the palace of King David. Let alone the simple fact that calling it the palace of King David goes against the Bible. And the biblical text, and here I am the guardian of the Bible, because of a simple reason that the Bible represents the situation in late monarchic times, when the tradition in Jerusalem was that the palace of the Davidic kings, and they knew the palace because it stood only 200 meters from them, the palace of the Davidic kings was on the Temple Mount. The complex of palace and dynastic shrine. The temple in Jerusalem is a dynastic shrine, is a royal shrine, adjacent to the palace. I suppose that the palace was probably bigger than the temple. Okay, so this is in the Temple Mount. So the palace of King David, the palace of the Davidic kings, cannot be located in the city of David from the first place. But even if we take this aside and we look only at archaeology, the archaeological evidence also does not support this affiliation. So what can we say about the temple and the palace of the Davidic dynasty in Jerusalem? The way I understand it, the palace and the temple must have been located on the Temple Mount. If the temple was on the Temple Mount and the temple of Herod was on the Temple Mount, so the first temple too was there, located on the Temple Mount, the same location, of course. Then, since the temple was a royal shrine, a dynastic shrine, the palace must have been located next to the temple. So we are speaking about the Temple Mount. Speaking about it, and in my opinion, there is no reason to doubt that the existence of a palace and a temple as early as the 10th century BC. And why is that? For a very simple reason, that as I told you before, I'm working with the information from archaeology, which is impossible to retrieve in this case, but also the ancient Near East. And when I look around me in the Bronze Age, including the place that I excavated Megiddo, and in the Iron Age, when I look at Hama in Syria and Aleppo in Syria, in Sinjir, when I look at Sinjirli today in Turkey, when I look at Tel Tainat in the north today also in the southern part of Turkey, the kingdoms of the Iron Age, they always have a royal compound, from the beginning, established by the dynasty. This is the typical situation. When you have a dynasty, even a small dynasty, even ruling over a small territory, there's always a palace and a royal shrine. This is the thing. So there's no reason to think that Jerusalem was the only place on the face of the earth with no palace and temple until, let's say, the 8th or 7th centuries BC. This is completely illogical. However, there is another point here which is extremely interesting, I think. First of all, we need to remember, of course, that the description of we need not to forget, the description of the palace and the temple in Jerusalem in the Bible is a description of what the authors knew. So they describe what they see, let's say, in the 7th century BC. Okay? Now, what they see in the 7th century BC is probably a product of many renovations and extensions during the centuries, and the Bible itself testifies for this. For instance, in the story of the renovation, in Jerusalem in the time of King Jehoash, in the Book of Kings, renovations that took place in the second half of the 9th century. But there is another point here, even more interesting. I think that when we look today at the Temple Mount, we are in a way misled by the situation in Herodian Jerusalem. King Herod the Great constructed, this podium of the Temple Mount in order to carry the temple on top of it, on the platform. This was the single largest construction effort in the history, not only of Jerusalem, in the history of the land of Israel. In my opinion, if you take aside things like the national water carrier and things like that in the 50s in the modern state of Israel, this has been the largest construction activity in the history of Jerusalem until May 25th, 2011. That is to say, today. And then this huge construction effort in Jerusalem, the platform for the temple, first of all, buried everything which was there before. And secondly, created a situation. Jerusalem then was a very big city with many quarters, and the Temple Mount was devoted to the temple. So there was a huge platform for the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, for the many people who came there, and the temple in the center, and everything around it. And we think automatically, every single one of us, including me, the automatic way of thinking, I don't want to call it emotional, but the way of thinking is that this was also the picture of First Temple Jerusalem. But this was not, of course. This is a major mistake of all of us. Because when we look at the ancient Near East, when you look at places like Megiddo in the late Bronze, or Hama in the Iron Age, or Tel Tainat in the Iron Age, or now Aleppo in the beginning of the Iron Age, or Carchemish, in earlier times, and so on. You have a mound, okay? And in one corner of the mound, there's a palace and a temple, some sort of an acropolis, maybe even separated from the rest of the mound by a wall. Okay? So there's no reason to think about Jerusalem in a different way. And the question is whether in the first temple period, the temple accommodated not only the palace and the temple, but also a mound. I'm not the first to suggest this. First of all, I'm working together on this with my two dear, one student and one colleague here, Ido Koch and Oded Lipschitz. And secondly, the first to suggest this was, not the first even, but one who suggested it recently was Axel Knauf, a German scholar, who said that the Mound of Jerusalem is not in the city of David. It is in fact somewhere under the Temple Mount. And at the time, this idea was brushed aside. But when you come to think about it, it's a very possible idea. It's probable even. If you take the plan, the topographical plan of the Temple Mount of Jerusalem, and you simply reconstruct a mound on the Temple Mount, okay? And you, in order to be cautious, you pull back 50 meters or so from every wall, western wall of the compound, the eastern wall of the Herodian compound, in order to explain why there's no pottery for the Iron Age, let's say, all over the place. So you pull back 50, 60, 70 meters. You still get a mound. You can reconstruct a mound, well protected on three sides by topography, of the size of about 55 dunams. Now, just to remind you, Shechem of the Iron Age, which was described by Albrecht Alt at the time as the, how did he call it? The real queen of the land of Israel in antiquity because of its location in the center of the country, in the center of the land of Israel. Shechem of the Iron Age and the Late Bronze Age is about between 30 and 50 dunams. Hebron is 30 dunams. Bethel is 20 or 30 dunams. Megiddo, you know, the top of the mound of Megiddo is about 50 dunams, 60 dunams. So we are speaking, just imagine that you take Megiddo and you move it to Jerusalem and you plant it on the Temple Mount and you box it in under the Herodian compound. If this is the case, then we should look at the history of Jerusalem in a slightly different way. And this can resolve many problems. Not the big problems, because this is not going to make Jerusalem the center of the universe in the 10th century BC. But it explains, you know, part of what's missing, at least. This brings us to the rise of Jerusalem to dominance, you know, starting in the 8th century BC. Now, before we speak about the rise of Jerusalem to dominance, we have to take a step back and say a few words about state formation. Because, I mean, the rising of a big capital with a highly specialized administration, with stratified society and so on, this is part of this title, you know, state formation. Okay? In my opinion, you cannot slice state formation into many small parts. That is to say, you cannot say, well, yes, administration starts, you know, in the 12th century BC, and then, you know, trade relations started in the 10th century BC, and writing started in the 8th century BC, and ideology started in the 8.5 century BC, and so on. I don't think things work in this way. I think we are speaking about when we deal with state formation, we deal with the rise of more sophisticated kingdoms. State formation is a big word, okay? More sophisticated kingdoms in the ancient Near East, okay? With important capitals, we deal with a package. And the package comes together, and the package has several components. And the components are size of the capital, demography of the capital and the kingdom, population-wise, of course, evidence for trade and developed economy, evidence for a stratified society, evidence for sophisticated administration, and evidence for writing. And if you wish, also the need for ideological texts to support all this. This is what we see also in other places when we look around us. By the way, in the ancient Near East and beyond. I suppose that, I'm not an expert on the history of China in the days of the Qin dynasty or, the Tang or whatever. But I suppose that if you go there to a place on the face of the earth which is developed with texts and archaeology and so on, you see the same. It comes, state formation, kingdom formation, rise of developed capitals, they come in a package. So this is the background to what we are going to say now. I believe that in the case of Judah and Jerusalem, the package comes in the second half of the 8th century BC.